Hello, I'm back here again to read from The Eye of the Eye, from which nothing is hidden. Fabulous book written by David R. Hawkins. So I am reading now the last part of section 2, which is called the spiritual process. And this is chapter 6, the resolution of the ego. I'm really enjoying reading this again. And it's quite novel doing it here on YouTube. So, chapter 6. Get yourselves comfortable and we'll begin. So, the resolution of the ego. Revelation occurs when the obstacles standing in its way are removed. These obstacles fall of their own accord when their underpinnings are taken away. Such as an underpinning is the concept of cause. Why this realization is so important can be grasped when we see that the belief in cause is a major support of the illusion that one is separate, self-existent, and independent self or ego. Cause is implicitly dualistic. There is a this that causes a that. There is therefore an imputed logical necessity for an I that is the explanation and the cause of the that of actions. Thus, there is an imaginary thinker behind thoughts, a doer behind actions, a feeler behind feelings, an inventor behind inventions, etc. Also characteristic is the confusion of identity with actions and behaviours, roles or titles. This confusion arises from the misidentification of the self, not only as a separate doer, but it also goes on to blur into a self-image that one is one's actions, behaviours, feelings, thoughts, etc. The belief that one is certain qualities, such as good or bad, or one's vocation, tends to embroider the illusion of a separate doer behind the actions, with an endless list of descriptive adjectives. The I becomes submerged beyond recognition into an endless morass of self-definitions. If they are good definitions, one feels happy. If they are bad, one then feels depressed or guilty. In actuality, all self-definitions are fallacious and equally misleading. It is useful to recognize that the illusion of a separate self or entity creates a false identity whose tenacity is seemingly difficult to overcome for several reasons. One becomes enamored of this precious self, which then becomes an obsession and the subjective focus of languaging and thought. The self becomes glamorized as the hero or heroine of one's life story and drama. In this, the I, self, becomes the perpetrator, the victim, the cause, the responsible recipient of all blame and praise, and the principal actor in the melodrama of life. This also requires that the self be defended and that its survival becomes all important. This includes the necessity to be right at any cost. Belief in the reality of the self becomes equated with survival and the continuance of existence itself. To transcend the identification with the self therefore requires letting go of all of the above mental propensities. This requires the willingness to sacrifice all these traits and mental habits to God out of love and humility. Radical humility can be arrived at only by confining thoughts and opinions to their verifiable validity. This means the willingness to let go of all presumptions of thought. With persistence, the vanities disappear as truths and are now seen as the basis for errors. In one final glorious crash, one realizes that the mind does not really know anything. If anything, it only knows about, and it cannot really know, because to really know means to be that which is known. E.g., to know all about China doesn't make one Chinese. To limit the mind to what it provably knows is to reduce it in size and influence, so it becomes one's servant and not one's master. It becomes obvious that the mind actually deals in presumptions, appearances, perceived events, non-provable conclusions, and mentations that it misidentifies as reality. No such reality as that constructed by the mind actually exists. The mind tends to be expansive and credits itself with worthy thoughts and opinions. When carefully examined, one finds that all opinions are worthless. They are all vanities and have no importance or intrinsic merit. Everyone's mind is loaded with endless opinions, and when seen for what they are, opinions are really only mentations. What is of more importance, however, is that they stem from and reinforce positionalities, and it is these positionalities that bring on endless suffering. To let go of positionalities is to silence opinions, and to silence opinions is to let go of positionalities. The value of memory also becomes diminished by the realization that not only does the mind misperceive in the present, but also it routinely does so in the past. And what one is remembering is really the record of past illusions. All past actions were based on the illusion of what one thought one was at that time. There is profound wisdom in the rueful saying, "Well, it seemed like a good idea at the time." With contemplation and meditation, the belief in an imaginary I as one's actual self diminishes as all phenomena are realized to be happening of their own and not as a consequence of an inner volitional I. The phenomena of life are not being caused by anything or anyone at all. It is at first sometimes disconcerting to realize that all the events of life are impersonal, autonomous interactions of all the facets of prevailing conditions of nature and the universe. These include bodily functions, mentations, and the value and meaning the mind places on thoughts and events. These automatic responses are the impersonal consequences of prior programming. In listening to one's thoughts, one realizes one is just listening to all that programming. There really is not an inner me that is causing the stream of consciousness. This discovery can be made through the simple exercise of demanding that the mind stop thinking. It becomes apparent that the mind completely ignores one's wishes and goes right on doing what it does because it is not acting out of volitional choice. Frequently, in fact, it does the exact opposite of what one wishes. Basic to the ego's continuance and capacity to dominate is its claim to authorship of all subjective experience. The I thought is extremely quick to interject itself as the supposed cause of all aspects of one's life. This is difficult to detect except by intense focus of attention during meditation on the origination of the thought stream. The time lapse between an internally sensed occurrence and the ego's claim to authorship is about 1/10,000th of a second. Once this gap is discovered, the ego loses its dominance. It becomes obvious and one is the witness of phenomena and not the cause or doer of them. The self, then, becomes that which is being witnessed rather than identifying with it as the witness or experiencer. The tracking capability and function is interesting. The ego actually interposes itself between reality and the mind. Its function is like the tape monitor function of a high-fidelity set. The tape monitor plays back the program that has just been recorded a split second prior to the playback. Therefore, what the person experiences in ordinary life is an instant replay of what the ego has just recorded. In this split instant, the incoming material is instantly edited by the ego in accordance with its previous programming. Thus, distortion is built in and automatic. This screen obscures reality and hides it from awareness. One of the first things noticed when the ego is transcended is the enormous transformation of all life into intense aliveness. One gets to experience reality before it has been distorted, muffled, and edited by presumption. The impact when one first experiences life presenting itself as it actually is overwhelming. Just moments before the illusion of the false self disappears, it has, in its remaining seconds, an emerging glimpse of reality as it never could have ever even imagined it. The demise of the ego's perceptual apparatus reveals wondrous splendour. In that split second, actual death was also felt as the remnants of the ego structure expire with the belief that it alone was real. In summation, it can be said that the ego is a compilation of positionalities held together by vanity and fear. It is undone by radical humility, which undermines its propagation. Another underpinning of the ego is our belief that it is our source of comprehension and survival, and we look to it at the front of information about ourselves and the world. We see it as our interface with the world, which, like a TV screen, brings the world and its meaning to us, and we fear we would be lost without it. Throughout one's lifetime, the ego self has been the focus of one's endeavours. Therefore, the emotional investment in it has been enormous. The ego is both the source and the object of striving, and is heavily imbued with sentiment, as well as the whole gamut of human feelings, failings, gains and losses, victories and tragedies. One becomes obsessed with and enamoured of this entity, its roles and its vicissitudes. The sheer mass of investment in the self makes it seem too valuable to relinquish. We are anchored to it by all the years of intimate familiarity, the hopes, the expectations, and the dreams. One becomes attached to this me that is thought to be central to the experience of life itself. In addition to this enormous lifetime investment in what we believe to be ourself, there appears to be on the horizon of the future the spectre of death. The awful information that this me is actually fated to come to an end seems incredulous. The prospect of death as an ending to the me seems unfair, bizarre, unreal, and tragic. It makes one angry and frightened. The whole panoply of emotions that have been lived through as a consequence of being alive now has to be replayed, but this time about death itself. The relinquishment of the ego self as one's central focus involves the letting go of all these layers of attachments and vanities, and one eventually comes face to face with the ego's primary function of control to ensure continuance and survival. Therefore, the ego clings to all its faculties because their basic purpose, to ensure its survival, is the reason behind its obsession with gain, winning, learning, alliances, and accumulation of possessions, data, and skills. The ego has endless schemes for enhancing survival, some gross, some obvious, others subtle and hidden. To the average person, all the foregoing seems formidable and bad news indeed. For those who are involved in advanced spiritual work, however, the good news becomes apparent. In actuality, the ego self doesn't have to die at all. Life doesn't come to an end. Existence does not cease, and no horrible, tragic fate is waiting to end life at all. Like the ego itself, the whole story is imaginary. One does not even have to destroy the ego or even work on it. The only simple task to be accomplished is to let go of the identification with the ego as one's real self. With this relinquishment of identification, It actually goes right on walking and talking, eating and laughing, and the only difference is that, like the body, it becomes that instead of me or this. All that is necessary then is to let go of ownership, authorship, and the delusion that one invented or created this self, and see that it was merely a mistake. That this is a very natural and inevitable mistake is obvious. Everyone makes it, only a few discover the error and are willing or able to correct it. The likelihood of correcting this error of misidentification is a transformation that actually cannot be done without God's help. To let go of one's seeming very core of existence appears to need great courage and resolve. At first, the prospect seems formidable and involves fear of loss. The fear that I won't be me comes up. There is fear of the loss of security and the familiar. Familiar means comfort, and there is the underlying phrase, the me is actually all I have. To let go of this familiar me brings up the fear of voidness, non-existence, or possibly the dreaded nothingness. To ease the transition of identification from self to capital Self, it is helpful to know that the lesser becomes replaced by the greater, and thus no loss is experienced. The comfort and security that were gleaned from clinging to one's identification with the small self is minuscule compared to the discovery of the true self. The self is much closer to the feeling of me. The self is like me instead of just little me. The little me had all kinds of failings, fears and sufferings, and the real big me is beyond all possibility. The little me had to carry the burden of the fear of death, whereas the real me is immortal and beyond all time and space. Gratification at the transition is complete and total. The relief that all one's lifetimes of fears were groundless and imaginary is so enormous that for a period of time it is very difficult to even function in the world. With the reprieve from the death sentence, the wondrous gift of life with a capital L springs forth now in its full splendour, unclouded by anxiety or the pressure of time. With the cessation of time, the doors swing open to an eternity of joy. The love of God becomes the reality of the presence. The knowingness of the truth of all life and existence stands forth with stunning self-revelation. The wonderment of God is so all-encompassing and enormous that it surpasses all possible imagination. To be at last truly and finally home is profound in the totality of its completeness. The idea that man fears God then seems so ludicrous that it is a tragic insanity. In reality, that which is the very essence of love dissolves all fear forever. There is also a divine comedy in the absurdity of mankind's ignorance. At the same time, the blind struggles and sufferings are seen as pointless and needless. Divine love is infinitely compassionate. That people believe in a God who gets upset and angry at people's limitations is hard to believe. The blind world of the ego is an endless nightmare. Even its seeming gifts are evanescent and hollow. The true destiny of man is to realize the truth of the divinity of one's source and creator, which is ever present within that which has been created and is the creator, the self. To be content with living in the confines of the ego is a pathetic price to pay for the measly crumbs that the ego repays for submission and subservience to it. Its little gains and pleasures are pitiful and only fleeting and transient. Another reason the ego is tenacious in its fear of God. This fear is aided and abetted by the prevalent misinformation about the nature of God and on whom, in this process of personification, all kinds of anthropomorphic defects are projected. All kinds of anthropomorphic defects are projected, which distort man's imagination about the nature of deity itself. Like a giant Rorschach card, man's fantasies about God become, as Freud correctly said, the ultimate repository of all man's fears and delusions. Freud's limitation was that although he was correct in stating that no such false God exists, he did not suspect that, on the contrary, a true God does exist, which accounts for Freud's calibrated level of 499. Carl Jung, one of Freud's contemporary psychoanalysts, went beyond Freud and proclaimed the truth of man's spirit and the validity of spiritual values. Therefore, Jung calibrates at 540. In these observations, we clearly see the demarcation and the limits of reason, intellect, and rationality. To understand the nature of God, it is necessary only to know the nature of love itself. To truly know love is to know and understand God, and to know God is to understand love. The ultimate awareness and knowingness in the presence of God is peace. That peace proclaims infinite safety and preservation with infinite protection. No suffering is even possible. There is no past to regret and no future to fear, because all is known and ever present. All possible uncertainties or fears of the unknown are dissolved forever. The guarantee of survival is absolute. There are no clouds on the horizon, nor is there such a thing as a future or a next instant that could be hiding someone awaiting misfortune. Life is a permanent today. The state of reality precludes any causes, and there is no possible relationship between a subject and an object. Thus, there are no nouns, no pronouns, no adjectives, no verbs, no other, and in fact no such thing as relationship is even possible in reality. Neither gain nor loss is possible. The self already is all that is, and nothing is incomplete. There is nothing that needs to be known, and no question remains. All goals have been totally completed, and all desires satisfied. The self is without desire and free of wants or cravings. It already has everything by virtue of the fact that it is everything. To be all that is precludes all possible lack, and there is nothing left to do. There are no thoughts to think. There is no mind to be concerned with. The self, God Atman, has no needs. It does not get pleased or disappointed. It has no feelings or emotions. It has no beliefs or attitudes. The existence of the self is effortless. That which is the very source of existence is forever free and unconditional. The resplendent power of God is self-luminous in the very light of consciousness itself, which has no necessity for a body, nor any materiality or form. The self is non-critical, impartial, totally available, present and accepting. It is completely safe to surrender the little self to the self. The unconditional love of the self or the little self is its guarantee of mercy. The emanation of self to little self is the province of the Holy Spirit, which is the link between spirit and ego. By prayer we request, permit and choose through free will to allow the Holy Spirit to be our guide. By God's grace, the transformation to enlightenment is made possible. It is said that the resolution of the ego is made difficult by resistance. The ego doesn't want to change or be changed despite its sufferings, fears, and regretful miseries. It clings to being right at any cost and frets and jealousy guards its cherished beliefs. It is, in fact, not an enemy to be vanquished, but a patient that needs to be healed. The ego is actually ill and suffers from delusions that are intrinsic to its structure. The return to sanity requires only the willingness of humility. Truth becomes self-revealing. It is not something to be attained or acquired, but instead shines forth of its own accord. The peace of God is profound and absolute. Its presence is exquisitely gentle and complete. Nothing is left untouched or unhealed. Such is the nature and quality of love. The self is the very fulfillment in manifestation of the Creator as existence itself. Nothing exists that is outside the love of God. The story of truth has been told repeatedly throughout the ages, but it bears telling again. Into the void-like space created by the ego's realization that in actuality it knows nothing, suddenly flows the love of God, like a dam that has been opened. It is as though divinity had been waiting all these millennia for this final moment. In a moment of serene ecstasy, one is home at last. The real is so overwhelmingly, obviously and totally present that it seems incredulous that belief in any other kind of reality is even possible. It is like some strange kind of forgetting, like the story of the Hindu god who willed himself to be a cow and then forgot that he had done it and had to be rescued by another of the gods. Sometimes the ego misidentifies itself more specifically as a personality. It thinks, I am such and such a person, and it says, well, that's who I am. From this illusion arises the fear that one will lose one's personality if the ego is relinquished. This is feared as the death of who I am. By internal observation, one can differentiate that the personality is a system of learned responses, and the persona is not the real I. The real I lies behind and beyond it. One is the witness of that personality, and there is no reason one has to identify with it at all. With the emergence of the real self and the true I, the personality, after some delay of adjustment, goes right on interacting with the world, which does not seem to notice the difference. The personality continues to be sort of entertaining and often comical, and like the body becomes sort of a novelty. Instead of little me, the persona has become an it that runs on its own generator, so to speak. It has its habits, styles, likes and dislikes, but they are no longer of any real significance or importance, and they have no consequence of happiness or unhappiness. Likewise, a lingering semblance of ordinary human emotions also seem to come and go. But they have no influence or power because they no longer have any identification or ownership as mine. People in the world seem to expect certain responses and get upset if these do not occur. So out of love, they are allowed to seem to occur, although they are actually slight and of no real importance or significance. With the relinquishment of identification of the self with the ego, it is difficult and not natural to become involved in the details of the world that require linear processing. The focus now seems to be on essence rather than on details of form that require extra energy to handle. This is partially due to the fact that the brain's EEG frequencies that accompany advanced states of consciousness or enlightenment are slow theta waves, 4 to 7 cycles per second. They are slower than the alpha waves, which are 8 to 13 cycles per second, that occur in meditation. In contrast, the ordinary mind, which is an experience of the ego, is predominantly at 13 plus cycles per second of beta waves. The world seems to pay endless attention to the irrelevant, and it is necessary to recall that it considers such things as important, significant, or even worth dying for. Out of respect for people's feelings, some approximation with normal social responses is reassuring, or else people feel rejected or unloved. For instance, people react with happiness or sadness to what they perceive as gains or losses. In actuality, neither is really occurring, but it is obvious that it is experienced as real by the individual. Sympathy, in the meantime, has been replaced by compassion and awareness rather than by a concordant emotionality. What the people in the world actually want is a recognition of who they really are on the highest level, to see that the same self radiates forth within everyone, heals their feelings of separation, and brings about a feeling of peace. To bring peace and joy to others is the gift of the benevolence of the presence. And that's the end of that chapter. So I'll finish there. Hope you enjoyed it. I loved it. And hopefully see you next time. Bye for now.